Okay, hello everyone. I had a question on my channel for an older video, and I thought I'd put this one together because the question kind of related to another feature that I wanted to talk about, which was creating custom Highpass. And the question was, how do I take my landscapes and sharpen them, right? Add to the details so they don't look quite as blurry. And in this process, there are some tools that exist directly in here. Things like the aperture tool, which will definitely sharpen the ridges, but then you end up losing a little bit of detail. You can use other things like the Sharpen, but the Sharpen itself, which, I mean, it seems like an obvious choice, really kind of isolates sort of peaks, things that are already high contrast, and makes them even stronger contrast. Well, it tends to ignore other features, right? So you notice that there's only changes at the very ridges, but not anywhere else. So you can, of course, take it out of here as a mesh, and then pull on the normals. And if I just scroll down here, deformation, something like the inflate, and rather than pulling it right and inflating it, I'll use it to kind of push in on the normals. And it's very easy to take this too far because, you know, you can really crunch things, but it does sort of sharpen the details a little bit. So if you bring it just a little bit, you can make everything look a little bit sharper than it was, and that works. In Maya, this would be something like the transform tool, which also pushes on the face normals and would do much the same thing. So you lose a tiny bit of volume in order to gain certain sharpness to other features. Which, unlike this one, which is simulating the same kind of effect, you end up losing details. Now, the Highpass, if you're familiar with what a Highpass does, in audio it isolates a specific frequency, and in Photoshop it isolates the same kind of idea, but if you think of frequencies sort of as gradients. And so I use Highpass to do things to textures, like remove vignetting from the camera, or to remove like a flash if I needed to use a flash, and it will flatten out the lighting of that specific piece. I can even take it down even further, isolating sort of medium gradient regions to eliminate certain like dappled lighting or other effects which might have been occurring at the time that I was taking the photo, to really kind of flatten out the overall lighting of the piece. I can also use it, a number of other people have, for photography purposes, to take images that have like a slight blur, and then you run the Highpass on a really high level so that you might analyze just the small edge detail, and then you use that as an over to the image to sharpen it, which will refine edges, basically. It works better than some of the other sharpening features. So in here, I would like to create sort of like a Highpass moment, managing those two same concepts, because we're dealing with grayscale imagery and we're dealing with frequency of noise. And so I want to isolate a specific frequency of noise to be able to enhance it, to make it stronger. The way to do that, of course, is to go ahead and blur it. By blurring it, you notice I've eliminated all the small frequency noise, leaving basically the big frequency noise, which is this big mound. By then taking it into here, and take note of the order of operations here. This is plugged into the bottom, this is plugged into the top. And then I refine this down until I get to the point where it starts to clip. Once it gets to clip, I just pull it back so I get rid of any kind of clipping. I don't want to lose details. And that is the range of noise that I've isolated. I can then reapply that noise, again using the difference here, so subtract, difference, and you can see I've added that back in, full power. You can determine how much intensity you want here. If you don't want it that sharp, you can pull back on it, and you're taking that and you're emphasizing the grooves, you're emphasizing the peaks. Everything is kind of combined together, which is great. So because I've taken sort of large scale noise, I'm decreasing a bit of volume, right? So I'm still losing a bit of volume, but that's what it takes in order to really kind of push on those inner grooves to really enhance them, make them more powerful. Now, by altering my blur, I can go ahead and isolate smaller and smaller ranges. We'll do that in a second. But some other ways that I can utilize this is by combining it back with itself in other creative ways. So I've taken that, I've isolated it, and here I'm running a rugged displace on this. I could make it stronger if I wanted. And I take this new feature and kind of combine it with the other one. And so now I've made sort of more complex erosion onto the surface without really changing the silhouette a ton. So it's more detail, it's all based on the same kind of formation, but off we go. Another possibility is, rather than being based off that original formation, is adding it to other formations. So if I bring it inside a mountain and I add it here, you notice it adds that detail, which adds more complexity to this, but it still has things like the erosion lines and other stuff in there. But they go contrasted to the actual shape of the surface, whereas the actual erosion would look something like this, right? And it's not that this is bad, it's just that it's very smooth. So doing this adds more complexity. Alternatively, I can take it and I can add it to this erosion and add complexity, and I just control how much of it I want to add to determine how much it's going to impact that surface. Again, adding detail overall. So if I were to isolate a smaller range just by taking down the blur, so say going down to right about here, you notice some of these other medium range frequencies start to pop back in. And if I go further, again, same kind of thing. I see smaller and smaller details. So we're isolating now all the really small stuff. I can subtract a little bit more before I start to clip. Oh, I'm clipping there, so pull back a little bit. Say right about there. Add it back in. It's not updating, so let it do that. And what you see here is now much less loss of volume, and focus on much of the smaller details. So the amount that they push on, really it's an overall sharpening of all of the features, unlike the Sharpen, which just isolates those things. You see how they're very similar in how they look, but now everything's being sharpened. And of course, you know, the same kind of deal once you change this. The frequency of the details that you add back in are smaller. And this impacts, you know, the feeling of scale for these things. So here I'm adding sort of micro details to this. Same thing for this erosion. Got the erosion here, doing that, and now these details are smaller on the surface. And that ends to the overall feeling of scale for this piece. Now keep in mind we're only at 1K, so obviously this is not as detailed as it could be. I could go up to 2K and have a look at what this looks like. And through the power of pause we can, so we look at, you know, what this is doing here. We've got our surface, and we run that on it, or we run this Sharpen on it. And you see what kind of details are isolated. There's hardly anything visible here, versus going from this to this, where obviously everything is added, and again you can control the amount of that, as well as adding the contrasting shapes on there, or adding it to our mountain here, or to the erosion of the mountain. And all of it just shows up in much smaller details and just makes everything look more interesting. So hopefully you have some ideas now, something that you can do to play with. Really it comes down to this little structure here, choosing the frequency that you want to basically exclude, remove, then subtracting it so that you don't get any clipping, and then recombining it. Just keep in mind the which one goes into which port that you can see here, and everything should work out fine. So that's it. See you in the next video.